Testing for coronavirus has always been a method to not only help curb the pandemic, but also in being able to tell when it ends.
The most important framework is our capacity to expand our testing.
We're going to have to be very smart about how we re-engage. We're going to have all sorts of protections in place, and we're going to have a lot more testing.
Figure out how to do testing.
Despite widespread calls for surveillance testing, the United States was slow to increase testing in areas across the country from the outset.
Waiting in line can take several hours in some cases. Hard Rock Stadium is one of the busiest drive-through sites in the state.
As some lines for drive-through testing just get longer, there is agreement on one thing. The country is not testing nearly enough.
As we've been saying for days and weeks, a lack of testing is crippling the country's coronavirus response.
Still, in March, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar promised 4 million tests would be available by the week of March 16th.
This week we'll keep ramping up production, so as many as 4 million tests next week are going to be driving forward. So everything is on schedule for the testing.
So we're now in April. Has the testing hit the 4 million mark like Azar promised? Well, let's take a look. The CDC and federal public health labs have tested more than 330,000 people since mid-January. When state labs, universities, and private hospitals are taken into account, more than 3 million people have been tested, according to the COVID tracking project run by The Atlantic. That's an increase for sure, but that's not the 4 million Secretary Azar promised the United States would hit more than a month ago. And states are largely on their own to devise their strategies. In New York State, for example, which has the most confirmed cases, more than 526,000 people have been tested. In California, the state with the largest population in the country, just more than 227,000 people have been tested. In Texas, which has about 8 million more people than New York, about 150,000 people have been tested. And some governors claim that they don't have nearly enough tests to begin with.
To identify the...
Governor Jay Inslee of Washington has said his state is in, quote, dire need of testing kits. Now, when asked directly about the lack of tests, Vice President Pence, who leads the White House coronavirus task force, shifted the blame away from the federal government.
On March 9th, you said 1 million tests had been delivered and another 4 million would be delivered by the end of the week. That clearly did not happen. What happened with those projections? What went wrong?
Well, I think the test kits were delivered, according to HHS, but the difference is between receiving a test and the ability to rapidly produce a result to that test.
We reached out to the Department of Health and Human Services for comment and have yet to hear back. Now, to be sure, some faster forms of testing and different types of testing, like antibody tests, are coming online. And as New York Governor Andrew Cuomo pointed out, testing will be key to reopening society.
So, the more testing, the more open the economy. But there's not enough national capacity to do this. I've been speaking to governors across the country. Every governor is now in the same situation.
Private labs also say that demand for coronavirus tests is down, and they have more ability to test people who aren't as sick. But still, there are challenges.
The thing we absolutely have to have in place, we better have in place, is the capability of very efficiently identifying, isolating, contact tracing, getting people out of circulation if they get infected. Because once you start getting clusters, then you're really in trouble. So to me, we have to have something in place that is efficient and that we can rely on. And we're not there yet.
And the question remains of how much the federal government will help states bolster their capacity in order to reopen safely.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.